Well, thank you for coming today, and especially I'd like to thank the Palmer family who have financially supported this lecture series, the Palmer Distinguished Lecturer in Canadian Studies, since 1991. We'd also like to express our condolences for the recent passing of Byron Palmer, who was a good friend, a great man, and really helped us in terms of development of Canadian studies. And I'd also like to mention Byron's brother, Delbert, who was instrumental in not only setting up this lectureship, but also in establishing Canadian Studies at BYU with me back in the 1980 academic year. We appreciate you very much. I am the 24th Palmer Lecturer, two of whom were former Prime Ministers of Canada, Joe Clark and Kim Campbell. Of course, one might ask, how does a kid born in Oakland, California, and raised next door in San Leandro, who spent his first 2 years at UC Berkeley during the turbulent free speech movement, and then was called on a 2.5-year mission to France, and later wrote his PhD dissertation on Franco-Soviet relations, how does he become involved in Canadian studies? My easy answer is I married a Canadian, Elaine Fisher, who is the sister of one of my close missionary companions in France. My ability to speak French, based on my missionary experience, was also part of this overall equation. Elaine and I were at UCLA for graduate studies and did not have much in terms of financial resources. We arrived at UCLA and had a nice apartment in nearby Brentwood. However, once we had our first child, Christopher, we had to move. No children allowed. Elaine managed our next apartment complex near Culver City, a complex owned in part by the actors Ryan O'Neal and Leonard Nimoy, the original Mr. Spock on Star Trek. There we could have children and balance our monthly budget, live long and prosper, Mr. Spock. I was also offered a position with U.S. Customs to work summers in LA International Airport because I spoke French. In addition, one day a representative of the Fulbright program was wandering the halls of political science at UCLA, and he approached me. He had learned that I spoke French and invited me to apply for a Fulbright lectureship to France, stating that very few people in the American West had any interest in going to France on a lectureship. I filled out the application and was selected to teach U.S. foreign policy at the Sorbonne in Paris during the 1974 academic year. French was also important in my attraction to Canadian studies. As an academic, my first major visit to central Canada was to Montreal, which I found to be the most continental European city in North America. I was also one of a small number of U.S. academics interested in Canadian studies who could actually converse in Canada's 2 official languages. And one of the reasons why I'm talking about French was I had a comparative advantage there. I was there at the right time to get, like the customs position and stuff like that. But you also have comparative advantages. Maybe it's the language, maybe you're coding, maybe it's dealing with statistics or methodology or whatever. Take advantage of that and particularly be aware of what the opportunities might be. It may pay off for you quite well. Today we celebrate Canada's 150th anniversary as a sovereign nation. When Canada was celebrating its 110th anniversary, that's 40 years ago, I received a Canadian government research grant to spend a summer learning about our neighbor to the north at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. From that experience, I wrote a short book entitled Canadian Government and Politics in Comparative Perspective, primarily aimed at an American audience. In the book, I refer to Canada surviving and prospering next to the elephant pit, in reference to Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's pithy comment at the Washington Press Club back in 1968. I'm quoting him here. "Living next to you is in some ways like a mouse sleeping with an elephant. No matter how friendly and even-tempered is the beast, one is affected by every twitch and grunt." Some argue that there are 3 great miracles in Canadian history. 1, the survival of the Aboriginal population, known today as the First Nations. 2nd, the survival of French Canada. And 3rd, Canada itself, with over 80% of Canadians living within 200 miles of a country with almost 10 times the population and 10 times the GDP. Twice in U.S. history, American forces invaded what is now Canada. In 1775, remember that's before the Declaration of Independence, and again in 1812, neither of which succeeded. In the 1860s, Canada, which was still referred to as British North America, was prompted in part to push for independence from Great Britain because they feared that the United States might invade because of Great Britain's support for the Confederacy early on in the U.S. Civil War. So they basically said, we need to become sovereign and independent. The Americans will not have a pretext to invade if we're separated from Great Britain. Interestingly, there was one more recent U.S. encroachment in Canadian affairs that remains somewhat controversial and that I experienced personally. In 1995, the federal government of Jean Chrétien permitted the Parti québécois to proceed one last time with a referendum to determine whether Quebec would separate from Canada. Early on, Chrétien was convinced that Quebec voters would easily oppose sovereignty, much as occurred in the referendum of 1980. However, voter sentiment began to shift dramatically during the referendum campaign, and Chrétien's government began to worry about the final vote. At the time, I was serving as a Fulbright Bissell professor at the University of Toronto. And because I had been president of the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States and written a book entitled Canada's Unity Crisis, I was invited by the Quebec government to serve as a foreign observer and spend time in that province interviewing groups and people on both sides of the issue. As the polls showed the side supporting sovereignty gaining momentum, Prime Minister Chrétien phoned President Bill Clinton and asked him to make a statement supporting Canadian unity. Clinton did so, stipulating that the referendum was strictly a Canadian domestic affair. However, he added that even if Quebec voters opted for sovereignty, the United States would not guarantee that Quebec would be able to join NAFTA, implying that Quebec's close economic linkages with the U.S. might be jeopardized, placing in doubt numerous existing businesses and jobs in Quebec. The vote on October 30th of 1995 was won by those opposed to Quebec's sovereignty, but by little more than 1%. Later in 1999, I was asked to attend a small invitation-only conference at the Mont-Tremblant ski resort in Quebec. Prime Minister Chrétien spoke to us about the virtues of Canadian unity. Later, at a small kitchen downstairs at the ski resort, President Bill Clinton spoke to us without notes and asserted that subunits in federal systems should not be permitted to separate unless that subunit is being grievously oppressed. Now, many Canadians appreciated what Clinton did in 1995 and what he said in 1999. However, many leading Quebec officials met with me and lamented that the U.S. had actively intervened in Canadian domestic affairs and that this intervention may have tipped the 1995 referendum in favor of the anti-sovereignty side. Now, as a postscript, there has never been a strong movement toward Quebec independence since that time, and sovereignty is not a front-burner issue in Quebec today. In addition, splitting from a country, even if done peacefully and in accordance with democratic principles, is extremely complex. For example, in the case of Quebec, should the rest of Canada have had a voice in the future of their country? Some Aboriginal groups within Quebec also reasoned that if Quebec could separate from Canada, why couldn't they vote to separate from Quebec or vote in favor of staying within Canada? Very complicated issue. Well, much of my work in recent years has been devoted to the U.S. role in global affairs and how we can become a better nation and adapt best practices found in the U.S. public and private sectors and in other nations in order to improve the quality of life of our citizens. In the case of Canada, I have been impressed that its healthcare system, although far from perfect, can offer coverage to its entire population at half the price per capita of the U.S. system. and still have people live longer and have a lower infant mortality rate than found in the United States. I have been impressed that Canada has done a good job in assimilating its immigrant population, with nearly 21% of Canada's population foreign-born versus less than 14% in the United States. I like its point system for accepting immigrants and find it far superior to the family reunification and lottery schemes used in the United States. I am impressed that at the K through 12 level, Canada is one of the top performers in the world in terms of science, math, reading comprehension, and general literacy, in spite of a large immigrant population coming from around the world and speaking many diverse languages. One needs to reflect on why the Canadian performance is generally so much better than what we find in the United States at the K through 12 level. I'm impressed that major Canadian municipalities tend to be more efficient with a higher quality of life than their U.S. counterparts, with more cooperation among core city and suburban cities in governing major metropolitan regions. I am impressed that Canada has much less violent crime proportionally than the U.S., including 7 times fewer homicides involving firearms. Last year, Chicago experienced 781 homicides versus Canada's 611 for the entire country. On the other hand, Canada struggles to provide solutions to the plight of some First Nations settlements plagued by intense poverty, substance abuse, and high suicide and homicide rates. Canada's spending on defense is still far below goals of NATO member countries, and its contribution to peacekeeping missions around the world has diminished somewhat over the past few decades. Canada has also faced some major problems linked to federalism, notably with Quebec. Even today, there are numerous provincial barriers to free trade within Canada itself, something with which the U.S. basically worked out in 1789. Now, in terms of bilateral Canada-U.S. ties, are seismic changes threatening the viability of this relationship? 2 recent events need to be highlighted. First is the U.S. government's reaction to the terrible events of 9/11. There were 19 terrorists, mostly from Saudi Arabia, involved in that fateful day in 2001, destroying the World Trade Center in New York City and causing damage to the Pentagon just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. The national government treated this event as a second Pearl Harbor. The Bush administration went abroad in search of dragons to slay. Invading Afghanistan in an effort to capture Osama bin Laden made some sense. However, this initial incursion was transformed into an ill-fated nation-building endeavor that has now become the longest war in U.S. history. Sadly, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was also ill-conceived, from my vantage point, and helped precipitate the growing influence of Iran in that volatile region and the formation of ISIS itself. The United States and Canada share the longest common border in the world, running 5,500 miles along the 49th parallel and separating Alaska from British Columbia and the Yukon. For almost every year since the end of World War II, the U.S. and Canada enjoyed the largest bilateral trading relationship on the planet. Only some form of official identification was needed to cross the common border, and at night, some of the remote border crossing stations in the West actually closed down, with officials placing orange cones alongside the road to let drivers know they were crossing from one country into the neighboring country. That was before 9/11. These tranquil days are long gone. After 9/11, the U.S. federal government greatly thickened the common border, and passports are now required in order to enter or re-enter the United States. Luminaries as diverse as Hillary Clinton and Newt Gingrich stated that some of the terrorists had entered the U.S. from Canada. Even years later, as Janet Napolitano was about to become director of the Department of Homeland Security, she insisted that some of the 9/11 terrorists had entered the U.S. from Canada. All 3 were totally mistaken. It never happened. The border has been fortified by the presence of many more federal agents. Massive inspections are also required on shipments of goods into the United States. And layer after layer of new regulations have been imposed by the United States, slowing the passage of trucks, adding to the cost of doing business, and raising consumer prices for Americans. To put this issue in perspective, there's just one bridge spanning the Detroit River between Detroit and Windsor, Ontario. This bridge carries far more commerce than annual U.S. shipments to Japan. Just one bridge. Billions of dollars have been spent on fortifying the border with thousands of new agents, regular surveillance flights, drones, sophisticated sensors, and other security measures. However, the U.S. Government Accountability Office has concluded that with all this additional spending, the United States can now effectively monitor 0.5% of the border with Canada. I served in the President Reagan's administration, and he once quipped that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, and I quote here, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." Now, I much prefer what we read in D&C Section 134. We believe that governments were instituted of God for the benefit of man, and that he holds men accountable for their acts in relation to them, both in making laws and administering them for the good and safety of society. Of course, this requires honest, well-educated, hardworking, and sensible elected officials and civil servants to be engaged in governance. I have been honored to serve twice as a civil servant, an agent for U.S. Customs, and later special assistant in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Once, I was directing BYU's Washington Seminar Program, and Elaine and our youngest daughter, Christy, and I rented a car, visited church sites in Palmyra, and then crossed into Canada so I could make a presentation in Toronto. It took 27 seconds to cross the border at Niagara Falls, with a Canadian agent saying, "Welcome to Canada and spend a lot of money while you're here." On our return at a remote and picturesque part of the Thousand Islands, there were 3 cars that crossed through the U.S. border station within a 5-minute period. Not very busy. The agent stated that personnel were going to scrutinize all cars, and then they drove our car to an adjacent area to inspect it from bumper to bumper and top to bottom. Meanwhile, we were ushered into a waiting area where a large group of agents were generally shooting the breeze with literally nothing to do. In essence, in reaction to 9/11, money had been thrown at a perceived problem. Staffing had been greatly increased, but common sense had flown out the window. 27 minutes later, we were allowed to continue on our trip, and Ronald Reagan's 9 most terrifying words were echoing in my mind. A much more tragic incident occurred later. A fire broke out in 2007 at an historic restaurant in Rouse's Point, New York. A call went out to the nearest fire department in Quebec to help. Its personnel responded immediately, only to be delayed for several minutes by U.S. federal agents who would not allow the fire trucks to enter the U.S. The historic restaurant burned to the ground. A few years ago, hoping that the passage of time had permitted officials in Washington to comprehend some of the excesses hastily put in place, excessive policies, in the wake of 9/11, I wrote a short essay entitled 7 Ways to Solve U.S. Border Problems. Unfortunately, little has been done in the interim to thin the common border with Canada. Now, the second major challenge facing the current bilateral relationship is President Trump's threat to terminate the North American Free Trade Area, otherwise known as NAFTA. The Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement went into effect in 1989, and at Mexico's request, and with the support of the George H.W. Bush administration, and later the Bill Clinton administration, Mexico joined Canada and the U.S. in the creation of NAFTA, which became operational in 1994. I believe that President Trump made a mistake when during his first week in office he ended U.S. participation in the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership, a major trade treaty between several nations in the Western Hemisphere and several in the Asia-Pacific region. Why give China an open invitation to become ascendant economically in the fastest growing region in the world, at a time when China has recently surpassed the United States, measured in purchasing power parity, as the world's largest economy. Why would we do that? Sort of an unforced error in tennis. The second mistake was that Trump ended the effective modernization of NAFTA, because all three NAFTA countries were signatories of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trump would have been better off demanding revisions to the TPP instead of rejecting it altogether. A third mistake made by President Trump has been the acrimonious language he has used toward Mexico and its proud people. I worry that this may be paving the way for the victory of López Obrador and his left-wing national regeneration movement in next July's presidential election in Mexico. López Obrador has never been fond of the U.S., has always been skeptical of NAFTA, and is opposed to allowing much-needed foreign investment in technology to help modernize Mexico's vital energy sector. His victory could lead to major new problems in U.S.-Mexico bilateral relations. After threatening to end NAFTA unilaterally, calling it the worst trade agreement in U.S. history, President Trump has at least agreed to attempt to modernize the accord. Negotiations began in Washington in mid-August, and 3 sets of negotiations have now been completed in the respective national capitals. And next week, a 4th set of negotiations will occur in Washington, D.C. The seismic change that could occur after the major disruptions imposed unilaterally by the United States following 9/11 would be for President Trump to walk away from the current trilateral discussions and give 6 months' notice to terminate NAFTA. I am hoping that this will not occur and that the current discussions will lead to a modernized and more efficient North American accord. The combined size of the 3 major North American economies is already far larger than the GDP of the European Union with its 28 members, even before the UK leaves. The population of NAFTA is also approaching 500 million people. The agreement is very limited in scope. NAFTA is not the EU. It does not allow the free movement of people across borders. It does not establish a common market nor a customs union. It does not have a common currency. Instead, it promotes greater trade and direct investment and the establishment of effective cross-border supply chains, permitting North American companies to compete more efficiently vis-a-vis growing competition overseas. It also promotes cross-border cooperation in terms of labor and environmental standards. Since NAFTA went into effect, U.S. trade with Canada and Mexico has grown more swiftly than U.S. trade with the rest of the world. Mexico has also become more democratic and ended the one-party domination of the PRI that existed continuously from 1929 until the year 2000. Greater cooperation has also occurred across common borders in dealing with issues such as terrorism, illegal immigration, and drug cartels. Historically, Canada-U.S. relations have survived various periods of tension and divisiveness. I believe it would even survive a seismic decision by President Trump to end NAFTA. In periodic Chicago Council on Global Affairs surveys, Americans perceive Canada as their best friend in the world, although admittedly, Americans do not know very much about what transpires in Canada. We are close military allies in NATO and the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and Canada currently has troops in Iraq and Syria fighting ISIS. Canada is the leading foreign energy supplier in the world to the United States. And North America as a continent is well situated to become an energy superpower. 35 U.S. states export more to Canada than any other country. And U.S. exports of goods to Canada are about equal to U.S. exports to the entire European Union. And Canada has 36 million consumers, and the EU has 510 million. And still, we ship about the same amount of goods to Canada as we export to the European Union. And in the Chicago Council on Global Affairs extensive survey released just this week, 79% of Americans, including 73% of self-identified core Trump supporters, perceive that Canada trades fairly with the United States. a far higher percentage than with any other U.S. trading partner. Now, my recent books refer to a powerful triple combination, a combination that is likely to lead to greater change in the lives of our young people than for any other earlier generation. Globalization is the first component, as the nations and peoples of the world become more interdependent and as borders become more porous. The second is unprecedented technology change, with some scientists contending that more data have been created over the past 2 years than in the entire history of humankind, just in the past 2 years. The third component is the Schumpeterian notion of creative destruction, in which we simultaneously create and destroy businesses and jobs. Last year, for example, in the United States, we created almost 2 million net new jobs. But what actually happened was that we created 29.6 million new jobs, but we destroyed 28.0 million existing jobs in an overall civilian workforce of about 160 million people. That means a lot of people were affected by either job creation or job destruction. No wonder so many Americans have major concerns about the future, about their own well-being and the well-being of their children. In addition, the global landscape may be changing dramatically. From about 1820 to the present, the North Atlantic region, basically Europe and North America, has been dominant in global affairs, beginning in Europe and then pivoting to North America. At the end of World War II, the United States alone accounted for almost half of the world's production of goods, almost half alone. And for a time, Canada was the world's number 2 leading economy. The ascendancy of the North Atlantic region in Europe and then North America also highlighted the benefits of democracy, representative government, capitalism, human rights, individual rights, and the rule of law. However, it's possible that by 2050, close to half of the world's population and GDP and exports and direct investment will have shifted to the Asia-Pacific region. A tremendous change from what we had beginning back in 1820 until now. If this transpires, some of the time-honored values we associate with the North Atlantic region may be called into question. For example, individual rights versus collective rights. Moreover, the United States is no longer a dominant superpower, and certainly not the hyperpower that the French foreign minister called us back in 1999 after the collapse, as you know, of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. For example, the U.S. population has never been higher, with 326 million people. However, our share of the world's population is only 4.4%. Our share of global GDP last year was a robust 24.6% when measured in nominal U.S. dollars. However, when measured in purchasing power parity, an index preferred by many economists, the U.S. share was only 15.5%, perhaps near the lowest level since about 1900. Consequently, it's not difficult to comprehend why some would like to recreate Fortress America and hope that within America's borders we could practice economic self-sufficiency. Unfortunately, the notion of Fortress America has always been mythical and is even a greater illusion today. Many of the challenges we currently face are beyond the capacity of any nation, including a superpower, to solve unilaterally. We must have goodwill and work across borders to solve problems that affect us locally in Provo or Peoria or Calgary and Saskatoon. America first should mean helping as many of our citizens as possible to achieve a very good quality of life. And that means solving problems at home, but also working across national boundaries to confront challenges common to Americans and Canadians alike. Better to modernize NAFTA than to end it, and better to work toward even greater cooperation and a smart border with our only neighboring country to the north. As John F. Kennedy stated in his address to the Canadian Parliament in May 1961, geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. Those whom God has so joined together, let no man put asunder. Sovereign, independent nations working together to benefit their citizens and to solve common problems with mutual respect and understanding. Undoubtedly, working together across national boundaries can at times be slow and cumbersome and frustrating. I have seen this personally as I have lectured in various European countries over the past several years and discussed the potential benefits of a free trade agreement between the United States and the European Union, and perhaps later a free trade accord between the European Union and the NAFTA countries. A couple of years ago in Munich, Germany, I was given a dressing down from an audience member on why Europeans should keep a great distance from what he considered as the overbearing American behemoth. He was expressing his own version of Fortress Germany or Fortress Europe. Yet isn't it amazing that extreme poverty, measured as living on less than $1.25 per day, has declined from 37% of the world's population in 1990 to less than 10% today, and that the infant mortality rate has been cut in half during that same period. This has not occurred because of Fortress America or Fortress Europe, or cutting oneself off from what is transpiring beyond one's national frontiers. Rather, it is occurring because of people and groups and governments working together to solve problems and improve the lives of our Lord's children. Hundreds of cross-border accords have been put into effect by the 10 Canadian provincial governments and by the 50 U.S. state governments. Individuals and organizations work together across the border to help solve problems facing both Canadians and Americans. I am hoping that seismic negative changes will not occur in this cross-border relationship, which is now 150 years old under sovereign national governments, and 230 years old between the United States and what was once British North America. A modernized NAFTA would be a significant step in avoiding a major seismic setback. I hope that this modernization effort will be successful. Thank you very much.
So we have a few minutes for questions. We like to ask you, for the benefit of our listening and online audience, to please come to the microphone here on this side. And if you're a BYU student, please tell us your name and what you're studying. Please.
Hi, Dale Cressman in Communications. Wondering if you would mind commenting on some of the current irritations that the U.S. and Canada are dealing with trade-wise, whether it be softwood lumber or this latest dust-up Boeing against Bombardier, and even whether that will result in Canada not buying F-18s.
Very good. Thank you. We do, for a long time, we've had problems with softwood lumber trade. The Canadians use a stumpage system to determine the price. We don't. We use more of a private market system. And as a result, we've had periodic difficulties with our lumber industry trying to limit the number of imports coming in from Canada. And this has gone on for decades, made some lawyers very rich. And it's not officially a part of NAFTA. We're hoping at the sidelines to come to an agreement where there will be a stumpage fee penalty for Canadian softwood lumber coming into the U.S. And that we can work it out. And I think we'll probably be successful. Whether or not it can be incorporated into NAFTA, that's another question. So we'll have to see what happens. The problem with us, of course, if we don't get the softwood lumber at the price that we now get it coming from Canada, it means if you're building a house, that house becomes more expensive because a lot of the lumber you would use would come from Canada. In terms of the Boeing Bombardier issue, Boeing, of course, is the big airline manufacturer in the world, along with Airbus. And Bombardier produces a jet which is smaller than Boeing produces, at least for the moment. And Delta Airlines is going to buy several of these jets from Bombardier. Boeing is claiming that Bombardier is subsidized by both the Canadian government and the Quebec provincial government. And as a result, there should be, subsidy action against Bombardier. And indeed, the initial preliminary decision coming out of the Commerce Department is that we would add over a 200% duty to the jets coming in from Bombardier. Now, within the next year or so, there's a second phase of this. And that final determination is made by the International Trade Commission, which tends to be less political than the Department of Commerce. So we have the preliminary position, notion that there's going to be over 200% duty placed on these imports. But the ITC, the International Trade Commission, will decide whether or not actually there is a subsidy going on and what should be the penalty. So we have some breathing room there. But Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who is the son of Pierre Trudeau, has said that Canada might rethink buying Boeing aircraft for its military sector, which would cost Boeing a lot of money. So anyway, we'll see what happens there. The Trump administration, first of all, this was ongoing, okay? So this wasn't something that was totally associated with the Trump administration, even though the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, does think that the U.S. should be tougher on some of these imports coming in. And we'll just have to see what happens on that. And I don't think it will derail NAFTA, but it can cause some headaches. And by the way, as the fourth session of negotiations go on next week in Washington, Prime Minister Trudeau is going to fly into Washington and talk to President Trump. And then he's going to fly to Mexico City and talk to President Peña Nieto. He's worried. He's worried maybe we're losing momentum. And he feels he has a good personal relationship with President Trump, and see if they can smooth out some of the irritants that are now occurring in these trilateral negotiations. So that's an update.
Hello, I'm Sarah Paul Hill. I'm an English major here at BYU. I was wondering about, you were speaking about kind of this shift of values from the Western world to kind of like the Eastern world, collective rights, that type of thing. And I was curious when you predict about when that would happen.
Well, in terms of nothing is written in stone, but by mid-century, we could see this shift economically. First of all, over half the population in the region, and then see GDP, exports, and direct investment grow to that point where it would become the dominant region economically. And so that could be by mid-century in terms of how that might spill over into other areas dear to us in terms of the rule of law, individual rights versus collective rights. That might seep in at some time then and then go on, even though some of the nations, of course, in that region are very pro-democracy, pro-representative government, and pro what we have had in the so-called North Atlantic region for a long time. But we could see some reverberations as early as the 2040s and the 2050s, particularly, again, if China becomes very, very ascendant in that region economically, also politically, that we could see some of the shift in values that we have held dear for a long time and felt that they would always be there. So that the notion that the U.S. model will always be the best model, some people around the world are saying, no, there may be an alternative model out there. And in particular, China is saying, maybe we have a better way to go. And so this could be somewhat something of concern for your generation as you take over our government.
Thank you.
Okay.
Alex Day, International Relations major. My question is, so traditionally the United States and Canada have had pretty good relations, pretty good friendship. Other than the US potentially withdrawing from NAFTA, what would be the greatest political or international strains on the US-Canada relationship?
Well, the NAFTA would be the biggie for the moment, because remember, we've had free trade with Canada since 1989, even before NAFTA. And so that would be a major setback. Some argue maybe we would revert back to that FTA, the Free Trade Agreement. I'm not sure. We may have to go to the World Trade Organization, and then the rules become more difficult. And beyond that, it also means there'll be spillover, I think, into the political arena. I feel it would be more pronounced with Mexico than with Canada. And eventually we'll get through it, particularly with Canada. But nonetheless, it would be viewed as a setback. And we have a lot of cooperation going on. As I said, Canadians have troops in the Middle East now fighting with us against ISIS. They're joint members of NATO, and we're the only two members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or excuse me, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. So that could spill over into a lot of areas which would not be viewed positively, I think, on either side of the border.
Okay, so if I could just ask a follow-up.
Mhm.
So other than NAFTA, are there other big issues that would strain United States and Canadian relations?
There are always some issues out there. We just mentioned softwood, which is sort of at the side. We worry about issues such as government procurement. We worry about rules of origin. A lot of these are within NAFTA. But they could strain what has been, up until recently with China being such a major exporter of goods into the U.S., which has been the largest trading relationship in the world, bar none. And so you could see with not only the thickening of the border since 9/11, but with a setback in terms of our economic and political negotiations, that somewhere along the line it would just, it will put a strain on a relationship that really doesn't have to be there. Because as I said, we have the capability in North America to become almost energy self-sufficient. Not totally, but almost. And that means you got to cooperate across the borders. And we could be doing more in terms of environmental issues and stuff like that. And that may basically slow down if we find that the U.S. basically unilaterally abrogates NAFTA. And then we move to some sort of different relationship with our neighbors both to the north and south.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
John Geilman, political science. You mentioned multiple times that it'd be preferable to modernize NAFTA instead of just ending it. Do you think modernizing NAFTA could be more favorable than the current NAFTA structure that we have?
Yeah, I do, because NAFTA went into effect before the digital age started. So we really do need to modernize and bring into account all that has occurred since 1994. And in that area, we tend to have an advantage. We tend to be very strong in high tech and other areas. So that could be an advantage to us. And some other areas where we might look at financial services and stuff like that, where the U.S. tends to have an advantage. With Canada, we have a slight deficit in goods with Canada, but we have a significant surplus in services with Canada, so that the overall trading relationship, we actually have a surplus with Canada. And if we could do more to liberalize the services sector and entry of our companies into the Canadian service sector, I think that would be a pretty good boost for the United States and create more jobs.
All right, thank you.
You bet.
Hi, I'm McKenna. I'm an English teaching major. I just have a question about the TPP. You mentioned how Trump kind of killed it within the first couple of weeks of his presidency. Do you think that there's a potential that a trade, something like that, will come up again in the next little bit, or do you think that it's kind of knocked out of the water for the next?
I hope it would, because the other members, we signed the agreement. We just didn't get it through Congress. The other members are now going to recreate it without the United States. And I would hope that maybe we might have second thoughts and say, well, maybe we'll talk to you, just like we're doing in NAFTA, and we'll make a change here or a change there, just like Clinton did with the original NAFTA negotiated by the Bush 1 administration. And I think that would work to our advantage, because we are a strong economic and political and defense player in that very key Asia-Pacific region. And we shouldn't step aside and allow China to sort of dominate and basically determine what the rules of the game will be. Because under the TPP, it's capitalism. You liberalize trade, you open up borders, and you play by the rules of the game. And if with the U.S. not there, you would think that China will be able to assert itself even more with rules which will not coincide with what we would consider to be the benefits of a free trade agreement. So I'm hoping maybe we'll have a second thought. President Trump has changed his mind a few times. And maybe say, well, okay, you've talked to me, you convinced me, we'll renegotiate. And I think that really would serve, that would be to our benefit. I think it would also be to our benefit of all our allies in the Asia-Pacific region who really want the United States there as a counterweight to what is transpiring in China, and also China becoming a more influential player in that entire region. That's what I hope will happen. Maybe you shouldn't hold your breath yet, if it will happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
Having gone to high school in Canada and graduated from that educational system and taught high school here in the United States, I find the major difference that I could recognize was that the fact that Canadians not only expect but demand a higher level of obedience in schools and performance. And United States is much more relaxed, and if kids get it done, they get it done. If it isn't, well, they'll graduate. So I just think it's an expectation on the part of the Canadian system. And that's not meaning to downgrade the American system, but that's, I still visit there often, and I still see that.
Very good. And, you know, in an age when the most important natural resource in the world is brain power, obviously we need to do better because our young people will be competing against the best and the brightest around the world. And so any improvement, of course, will mean that down the line we will be more competitive economically, and will also help the well-being of our young people as they enter the workforce.
That's right. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question.
Marissa Gerber, International Relations. What aspect of the NAFTA renegotiations do you think has the potential to cause the biggest shift between United States and Canadian relations? Is there a specific portion
You mean
of it?
the most irritation?
Yes.
Well, one would be what we call Chapter 19, where we look at anti-dumping and subsidy rules, and the Canadians like the system that's now in place. President Trump would like to do away with that, give more power to our own courts and to our own Congress. That could actually kill the deal. And there are other areas like Chapter 11, which deals with state investor relations, that could be a problem. President Trump is also calling for greater rules of origin, meaning more production in the United States, not just in Canada and Mexico, but the United States. And we have problems in terms of government procurement rules, Buy America provisions. So there's lots of potential problem areas down there. But hopefully, you know, I took part in the early negotiations with Canada on what we called sectoral free trade, and we got through it. The issues are more significant now. Our political leadership at the time I was there was favorable to what we were doing. And later on, during the 80s, Ronald Reagan was very close to the Canadian Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. We'll have to see now. We're not quite sure what President Trump will do in the future. He does have a good working relationship with Prime Minister Trudeau, not so good with the President of Mexico, Peña Nieto. So we'll see what happens. There's a lot of question marks there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.